Hi, and in this video I'd like to go over the class buffs which are coming back to battle for Azeroth and why they could actually be a pretty bad idea. This is mostly aimed at mythic raiding situations, but of course it could also have a profound effect on mythic plus dungeons, for example, and potentially other types of raiding, but much less so. Now, first of all, just to go over what these class buffs are. So each class brings a buff to their group or party, and they can come in several different formats. I've written on the right hand side what the class buffs are at the moment. As far as we can tell from data mining, some of these are actually in the BFA alpha at the moment, some of them have not been. So it's all from data mining, and as you can see with Shaman, we don't even know what theirs is at the moment anyway, or at least not quite yet. So Death Knights get a 5% leech, and this is an aura, which means it extends to 40 yards. Where I've written 40 yards after the buff, that means it's an aura that they passively do. Which means, of course, if in this case the Death Knight dies, then everyone would lose that 5% leech. Demon Hunters grant 3% haste, again within 40 yards, so it's an aura. Druids give versatility of 3% for 1 hour. So this is a buff that they place on the raid and lasts for an hour. Now, again, I'm not able to test this, but I'm assuming what that means is that if the druid dies, then the buffs remain because they're actively putting a buff on people as opposed to just generating an aura. Otherwise, why would the time make any sense? It doesn't. So this is presumably a buff that is physically applied. Hunter grants everyone movement speed of 15%. Again, it's an aura, 40 yards. Mage intellect buff 5% for 1 hour. So this is placed on a person that I have been able to verify because that is in the alpha on the mage. The monk grants mastery. I've not put a value there because it's an actual value on the data mine thing rather than a percentage. So that obviously that could change. And that extends to 40 yards. The Paladin grants a 10% armor buff, again 40 yards. Now, of course, that looks straight away pretty useless for most people. Obviously, tanks might get some benefit from it. Very few fights, particularly raid fights, grant a lot of very dangerous physical damage. But apparently it is supposed to include some general damage reduction as well. But by how much I can't say because that hasn't been put into the alpha as yet. It's in the files, which is why we can data mine it, but Paladins at the moment on the BFA alpha do not have that class buff. Priests grant stamina of 10%, again 1 hour, which means they place it on there. Rogues, a physical DPS 5% increase, but it's a debuff that they apply to their target, so it will only apply if you're hitting the same target as the rogues. Shaman, we don't know yet. Warlock, similar to the rogues, it's a magic increase, a magic damage increase of 5%. Again, it's a debuff. They do it via a curse which lasts for 1 minute. We're assuming that they can just reapply the curse at the end of that minute or just before the minute is over. And finally, warriors grant strength or agility of 5% increase for 1 hour, again placed on the raid there. Now, the ideal you would imagine on most raid fights, if not all, is to be able to get all of those buffs in there. So let's say you've got a 20-man mythic raid size you've got to fill. And let's say here's your roster. Now, there are, of course, we're assuming we want to get all the buffs in. It is, of course, possible that there are some buffs you can live without. But the reason why I'm going to say this is quite bad is for individual people within their raid group, they might be very good. We've already encountered, for some years, really, the concept that if your utility is super useful on a fight, particularly the very difficult fights of a raid tier, then a guild wants you in abundance. So you can have people who are actually not that brilliant, nonetheless get into those, they've got a guaranteed raid spot because they need their utility. On the flip side, you could have someone who plays a class that doesn't bring any utility at all. You are always going to be filling up those last few slots. There's always a few slots, 2 or 3 slots, where, do you know what, we shouldn't need anyone with any particular utility. You shouldn't need all 20 people to bring something. But it might be that it's very, very tight. There might be 5 or 6 people fighting for those spots. Now, let's look at tanks first of all. Tanks, you're likely to have 2. Now, I'm not suggesting this is a typical roster, by the way. No one's going to have 6 tanks. Although it is possible that some Mythic Raiding guilds have 2 main tanks who also keep well-geared and experienced alts so you can cover all of the tanking types, because some fights favour some tanks more than others. But let's just put, for example, let's just say that your tanks are, I don't know, Guardian, Druid and Protection Paladin, just for the sake of argument. So that means the Paladin and the Druid buff's covered. You don't necessarily need it within the other choices. So now let's say for healers, now you can see healers here, I've got sort of 1 of each. Now, of course, there's 2 types of priest healer. I could always nick a priest from over here if necessary. So you've got 6 types of healer. You may have duplicates in your particular raid. You might have 2 paladin healers, for example, or 2 resto druids. But let's just say at the moment, you're probably going to want a shaman healer. Paladin healers are always really strong. Druid healer, at least 1 priest healer. And, you know, that might be it, because 4 healer fights are fairly common. There are some fights where you want to do it with 3 healers. There are some fights where you want 5 healers. But generally speaking, you want about 4. So let's say that's our tanks and healers. So now what have we got covered? We've got the paladin double covered. We've got the druid double covered there. We've got the shaman buff, whatever that happens to be, covered. And we've got the priest one covered. So now we look to range. Now, generally speaking, with range, there are fewer choices for these, so you put 1 of each. Now, if we're looking here, we always want a warlock in at least, we always want a mage in at least, and probably at least 2 of one, 1 of the other. You're also going to have a hunter as well in there. In terms of the others, are we definitely going to need a shadow priest in there? Not necessarily for the buff, but let's say we put 1 in anyway, because range, very few fights want a small amount of range. You usually get like maybe 1 or 2 an expansion where ranged are not ideal, and maybe, you know, we stick in and, you know, let's stick in another warlock as well. So then we look at melee, and we're definitely going to want a rogue because we haven't got any of those. We're definitely going to want a warrior because we haven't got the warrior buff in there. We don't have a monk anywhere, so we're definitely bringing the monk buff in there. Demon hunter, of course, hasn't been used. Death knight hasn't been used. So these should now cover all the class buffs, and now we can just fill up the raid with whatever we need left. Now, so what have we got here? We've got 2 tanks, 4 healers, so that's 6. With the range, that's 12. Now I've got 17. So we've got 3 spots left. Now, in theory, that just means, okay, you can just fill it up with, oh, you know, the tanks and the healers are chosen. With any combination of ranged and melee, we've got 4 more melee players here. We've got 4 more ranged players, which is fine under normal circumstances. If it's just a fight where you just need your best players, then that's sort of okay. You've got 3 spots left for these 8 players. However, let's say it's a particular fight where you're going to need certain utility that is going to be extremely useful. So let's say that requires the second rogue, because you know how rogues are. Let's say aspect of the turtle, it's another game-breaking thing. So we put that in there as well. That leaves now 1 from all of this lot. Now, let's say it's a fight that doesn't really favour melee. Like, we've had this on particularly tough fights a lot through Legion. In the current raid tier, and Taurus, for example. Coven, Agrimar, and Argus, sorry, behave yourself, are all ones where you don't want a lot of melee. You don't want a lot of melee on Coven because there's various effects where you have to spread out. You don't want a lot of melee on Agrimar because you need enough ranged that the melee don't start getting the ranged abilities and having to move out. And on Argus, you've got to be able to spread out before the mythic abilities come in, whether it be the fear or the rage, which means you've got limited room around the boss, which sort of limits the melee. There's nothing else that really limits the melee there. So, you know, ideally on all of those fights, you don't want any more than 5. You can do it, of course, with a few more, but it becomes more difficult. So why give yourself a hard time of it? Why don't we just stick in a boomkin? Okay? And the rest of them, you know, are a bit cooked. So the Ret Paladin's a bit cooked because, you know what? The Paladin aura's already been brought by 2. And because it's an aura, sometimes you think with an aura, okay, what if they die? Well, we lose it. Or the debuff, indeed, with the Warlock and the Rogue. Again, if they die, then we lose that. But again, you could look at it like this. Are they likely to die? So Paladin tank, obviously that's not likely to die because, you know, if the tank dies and you can't res them back up, well, you're probably going to be wiping. Healer, Paladin healer, behave yourself, they never die. So then you're a bit buggered there. Shaman, both the elemental and the enhancement shaman. Well, we've got a resto shaman. Now, we don't know what the effect is there. Maybe if it's an aura that only extends 40 yards, there might be a case for bringing, for example, we could take the boomkin away and the enhancement shaman, because maybe it's a fight where there's a lot of room, and there are times when the melee and range camp are more than 40 yards away from each other, or it's pretty close, and it's a really useful class buff, in which case it makes sense to have, as well as the resto shaman covering the range there, an enhancement shaman covering the melee and tanks. The poor old boomkin there being displaced in that particular case, the poor old feral druid being displaced as well for the same reason, because theirs is a buff that's applied, it's not even a 40-yard thing. And this is the sort of crux. I mean, we could change various things. Let's say you don't have a paladin tank, you have a brewmaster instead. Well, all of a sudden we don't need the windwalker specifically. You know, that leaves room for something else. Maybe our boomkin gets back in there. If it's a fight where you don't really want a lot of melee, and we're looking here and we're thinking we've got 6 melee here, we really could do with getting rid of one. But it's still a fight where having 2 rogues is super useful, either because their damage is off the wall or because of the powerful utility they bring. And of course, that's all still to be decided. Remember, Blizzard have said that they've put the onus on their class development team to make sure that all utility is useful, but we don't know what they mean by that. Do they mean for Mythic Plus dungeons, or do they mean for Mythic raids? Let's say instead of the Guardian Druid, we have a Blood DK. Well, we now don't need that Blood DK anymore, and we could put someone somewhere else. And this is the issue we've sort of got. In fact, I would actually argue as a melee DPS class, in particular, because most of the fights favour strong range rather than strong melee. There is all the odd exception, like, for example, Mythic Gul'dan. But in a situation such as that, always have a look at the tanks in your raid. If the main tanks in your raid play the same class as you do as melee DPS, you're probably not going to be needed for the class buffs. And remember what I said. I mean, again, if I tidy all this up, as we've got it here, we need usually a good 16 or 17 to cover all the buffs, because you will get a little bit of overlap. Mages and warlocks, for example, it's always useful to be able to bring a couple of those. Rogues, it's usually always useful to bring a couple of those. There might be some overlap between the healer team and the tanking team. You know, you might have a Brewmaster monk and a Mistweaver monk who's really good. You know, you might have a Guardian Druid and a Resto Druid that's really important. And this, for me, is the essence of why the class buffs are not really a good idea. Now, I'm not going to suggest that, okay, we go on the forums and say we need these removed. They're not going to be removed for a number of reasons. First of all, I think a lot of people are probably quite positive about this. People, you can just see by looking through the forums, people are really hyped by things coming back. A lot of people, of course, didn't like the fact that the pruning that happened after MOP and after WOD, and the idea of bringing something back looks good. But in actual fact, this isn't bringing anything back. This isn't something that was used a couple of expansions ago. The buffs, the class buffs that were had then, were always covered by others. You know, so for example, as a paladin, I could buff stats on everyone, or I could buff mastery. But there were others that brought the same things. So you didn't really choose your roster based upon the class buffs, because you would have them covered without having to think about it. Now you won't. Now, for example, if you do without a Death Knight, you do without 5% leech. All right, that may not be important. It might be that you're on a fight where there isn't a lot of damage that's likely to kill people. Maybe you don't need the leech. Except remember, leech isn't just of benefit for DPS to self-heal, it's also very powerful for healers. The haste is always going to be useful, and it's going to be more useful for some than others. Let's say, for example, it had been Legion, where haste is super important for Shadow Priests, and let's say you've got 2 Shadow Priests in your roster, and they're both some of your best players. Then, of course, it would be folly to do without the haste buff there. Let's say you do without a Druid. Well, now you're doing without versatility. Well, that's just silly. Versatility, as much as some people don't like the stat, is always really useful. That's why Vantus runes are so good. It means you take less damage, and it means you deal more damage. The movement speed on the Hunter is variable in terms of usefulness. That will depend on a fight-by-fight basis. But remember, Hunters are always strong. You always really want at least one Hunter, and generally a couple is good. Mages, again, the intellect is only going to affect casters and healers. But again, if you've got a ranged heavy comp, it's very likely you've got a lot of those. So that 5% buff is going to be really important. And of course, even without it, mages are something you want to bring anyway. Monks with the mastery, that's variable depending on how much people benefit from mastery. But there's so much mastery where it is very useful. It's a useful stat to have, that surely you would want at least one monk to provide that mastery buff. The paladin armor one, well, you know, I'm biased there because I play a paladin. I'm disappointed with that one because it's a class buff that you're never... even on some progress fights, you won't get the benefit from it. You can only possibly get the benefit from it if two conditions exist. One, some people are likely to die. So, could progress fights, of course. That's where it'd be useful. Farm, less so. But secondly, if that extra damage reduction would save those people in that situation. Now, that may not be the case. It may be the case that the only time people die is when they fail mechanics. And in fact, even a 10% damage reduction will not save those people from that. Similarly, it might be one where you get large amounts of raid damage going out, which take most people's health off, and someone with a little bit lower item level could be saved by this, in which case it becomes useful again. But it is very much one of those where I envisage it's only been useful on a couple of fights, and you know what, you always have a Holy Paladin anyway. Priest stamina, same sort of thing as with the armor reduction really. That stamina, do you really need it? If your health never goes to super low levels, then again it's not very useful. It may have been more used to the tanks. So sometimes it's going to be useful and sometimes it's not. The rogue physical DPS debuff depends on, again, your balance of physical damage dealers. So hunters and most melee are going to be the ones that get some benefit from that one. How much benefit? Again, even that's variable. The ones who do pure physical damage, such as warriors, for example, are going to get loads of benefit from it. Ones who do a mixture of, say, spell damage and physical damage, ironically, rogues being one of those examples, is going to get less benefit from their own buff, which seems a bit weird. So it's not only of more benefit from some, just even having that class buff might get you to think, well, maybe we choose to take, say, a warrior or a feral druid over, say, an enhancement shaman or a ret paladin, because they do more of their damage with physical damage and they're going to get more from that buff. In a particular situation where you've got a really tight DPS check to make and you're really struggling with it, but you're almost there. That sort of thinking, again, determines who you bring. Shaman we don't really know about there. The Warlock, the magic DPS 5% debuff, is going to be really useful again for having lots of casters in there. And on most fights, if you had the option, you would be taking a couple of Warlocks, several Mages, a Shadow Priest. So that is actually going to be really useful. Plus the fact you're always going to want a Warlock either way. And it's a debuff that they can maintain as long as they don't die. Warrior, the strength and agility, of course, not going to be useful for the casters and healers. More of use to the physical damage dealers, ironically, you know, the melee and the hunters in the range camp there. That's who that's going to be most useful for. Also useful for tanks as well. But again, could you do without it? You probably wouldn't want to, unless, of course, you had virtually no melee. That's the only situation where you'd want to do without it. And again, it comes back to, if you're going to have that in the raid anyway, you ideally want to try and think towards yourself, well, let's get some people who are going to benefit more from those primary stats. So this is where we have to hope that more people benefit from their primary stat than their secondary stat, because, you know, those people are going to benefit from more from this buff. So there's lots of complexity to it, but I think the one thing that is certain from my point of view is there are going to be compositions that are determined in a lot of raid guilds. And I know I'm talking about mostly Mythic, which is, it's not as tiny a proportion as some people make out. There's a lot of Mythic guilds, but it is a minority of the player base, sure. Okay, granted. But then again, you have to ask yourself, when you're talking about the majority of the player base, how many are going to benefit from these buffs anyway? But as I've said before, Blizzard are not going to change it. It's a thing. It's going to happen. My issue really is they should at least make all of them as useful as each other, because some of these buffs are going to be useful in every single fight. And it doesn't matter whether you're progressing or whether you've got it on farm. Easy farm even. Some of these ones, the ones that improve your stats or you're directly boosting your damage, are always useful because they allow you to kill things quicker, to push phases quicker. It doesn't matter what the specific mechanics of the fight are, always good. The ones that are more defensive in nature are variable in their use. Sometimes they'll be completely useless, even on a progress fight, which might sound bizarre, but even on a progress fight, they might be useless. So they're a very, very niche use. But anyway, that's all I've got to say on the matter. Have a think about it. Comments down below if you've got any views on that one. I have put a post already on the Alpha forums about it, but you know, that's where that's going. I'm not going to sort of really go on about it too much more. I actually might go on about a little bit more. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already, share with other people who might also be interested, and until next time, I'll see you later.